Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome again to the NASIMCO mental health awareness programs that we have been working in collaboration with NASIMCO, myself, as well as the Nasiha helpline. And newly on board, alhamdulillah, is the Ahlul Bayt TV channel. Welcome everybody. Assalamu alaikum again. Alhamdulillah, over the last few weeks, we have been exploring a variety of mental health topics that impact us on so many levels, whether it's addictions, whether it's abusive relationships, and we see how it impacts us socially, spiritually, and especially within our network, and especially during the pandemic that we've been experiencing, subhanAllah. Another topic that's really important to explore and to understand the depths of it is grief. And when we take a look at grief, it is a natural response to loss, and it's the emotional suffering you feel when something or someone you love is taken away. Often, the pain of loss can feel quite overwhelming, and you may experience all kinds of difficult and unexpected emotions, of course, from shock to anger, disbelief, guilt, and profound sadness, of course. So the pain of grief can also disrupt your physical health, making it difficult to sleep, eat, or even think, focus in a way like that. So loss doesn't necessarily mean just death. It can also mean a divorce or breakup of a relationship or a friendship. It could be a loss of health, job, or financial stability. It could also be a miscarriage, could be retirement. It could be a loved one's serious illness, or like we said, a loss of a friendship. Today, inshallah, with myself facilitating, and I forgot to mention right at the beginning, my name is Berak Hussain, and I'm a psychotherapist where I do counseling at a local university medical clinic, but I also do a lot of mental health awareness. And joining us to explore this topic today, we'll have our special guests of Shaykh Vinay Khetia and Sister Farzana. And so Shaykh Vinay Khetia is in the final months, mashallah, of his PhD in religious studies at McMaster University with his thesis on the subject of the history and philosophy of Shi'i devotional literature through dua and ziyarah. And he's been engaged in full-time academic and seminary-focused study of Islam for the past 18 years. He has multiple peer-reviewed publications in the areas of Islamic law and Shia Islamic intellectual history more broadly. And he has a particular interest in religious spirituality and its intersection with modernity. Currently, he's the director of religious affairs at As-Sadiq Islamic School in Toronto, Canada, and just began teaching postgraduate Islamic studies at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Shaykh Vinay. Joining us from London, UK is a good friend as well as a colleague, Sister Farzana Karawalli, who is a nurse, a social worker, and a therapeutic life coach using cognitive behavioral therapy as well as neuro-linguistic programming. She is also the founder of Inspirational Minds at Stanmore Hujjat in London, where we've done many programs together over the last few years. Welcome to both of you. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum. When we take a look at the grieving process, it's really important to understand what it is that we experience. When you are suddenly experienced with the death of a loved one, perhaps a loss of a job, or any of the losses that we spoke about, it's a very individual experience, and there's no right or wrong way to experience this grief. How you grieve depends on many factors, including, of course, your personality, your coping style, and your life experience, your faith, and how significant the loss was to you. From a psychological perspective, we can see that the 5 stages of grief, and there's no gradual way of dealing with it or step by step, but usually we tend to experience these 5. Denial. So in denial, we would be saying things like, this can't be happening to me. This is not true. No, I'm just dreaming. This did not happen. Then we could potentially be experiencing anger. Why is this happening? Who is to blame? Pointing fingers. And sometimes we even find people even blaming God, astaghfirullah. So we hear this type of language as well. Then there's the bargaining, where the person begins to negotiate with their environment. So this didn't happen, this did not happen, or okay, so this happened, I will do this instead. How do I cope and deal with it? So that could be part of the bargaining. Then you could experience the depression, where you say things such as, I'm just too sad to do anything. I don't really care. I just want to stay in this place of sadness because that's all I'm experiencing. And then we have, inshallah, where we all hope to go to in a healthy way, the acceptance stage, where I accept and I'm at peace with what happened. I may not necessarily like it, but I accept that this is what happened and I've learned how to cope and deal with it along the way. So usually this is what we experience. And I see this a lot firsthand with clients when they first hear of a loss, they are in that denial and almost in that anger. And then they go through the sadness. They feel it more later on as time goes by. So this is somewhat from a psychological perspective. And we're going to take a look at it, inshallah, with the Shaykh's input on what the grieving process is from an Islamic perspective. And how did our prophets and A'imma go through this process?
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's a very good question, and we know that, as Imam Sadiq Salamullahi alayhi has said, that there has been no person who's been struck with a tragedy greater than that of Rasulullah himself. Adam al-Musiba. And the Imam says that whenever you are struck with a tragedy, fathkur musibata Rasulillah. Think about the musibah of Rasulullah, because nobody has a greater musibah than him. So it is very clear that the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and his experiences and his seerah becomes a life lesson for us. And we know obviously he lost children, he lost his wife at one of the most difficult moments in his life, he lost his uncle back to back. I mean, these were devastating losses in his life, and especially at a time where the entire ummah, where the mushrikeen, at that time in Makkah were against him, he was boycotted. So how did he deal with this? How did he face this? And then the loss of sons, the loss of children. Imagine, I mean, it's compound loss upon compound loss upon compound loss, again and again, and then knowing the impending tragedy of his daughter, knowing the impending tragedy of Imam al-Hassan, of Amir al-Mu'mineen, of Imam al-Hussain alayhi salam. So when we look at the life of the Prophet, we see a very interesting instructional example. But not only in the life of the Prophet, even the life of various companions of the Prophet as well, who lost children or had devastating losses in their lives. And that's one. The heart weeps, but the tongue does not utter anything that is against the rida of Allah. That is the rule that the Prophet has said, right? Al-qalb yabki, right? If the heart cries, the heart weeps. There's no doubt about that. He says that very clearly. There's nothing wrong in crying. Crying is normal. It's healthy. It's cathartic. It's a sign of our spirituality. It's a sign of our empathy. It's a sign of a healthy soul to cry. But those tears should never become something that leads us to utter something or to do something that is contrary to the pleasure of Allah. So it's a fine balance here, right? And of course, we are not permitted, it is highly disliked to engage in jaza or hala, upon our own loss. That is only for Imam Hussain alayhi salam and for Ahlul Bayt. Their mourning is not our mourning. We cannot compare our loss to their loss. But of course, crying and mourning and being sad and all of that is not only okay, it's a part of the spiritual healing process. If we don't go through it, then we can't begin to heal. And the Prophet himself cried. He cried after the death of Khetia. In fact, we read traditions where his later wives would find him crying during the day. And they would ask him, what's wrong? And he would tell them that I'm remembering Khetia. I'm remembering everything that she did for me. I'm remembering, all the sacrifices that she did, and so on and so forth. And the traditions are so many. So that's one way to begin the conversation about.
Thank you. Bless you, Shaykhna, for giving us that introduction and normalizing it, really, right? Because we do hear that our tears should only be for a certain ABC, and it takes away from the fact that we are humans and that we are going to experiencing. But then when you see how the Ahlul Bayt themselves experience grief and how they normalize it by showing that grief, and especially from a male perspective as well, right? Especially in our society where that can be frowned upon in terms of showing emotions, right? So thank you very much, and we'll delve into that a little bit more as we go through the discussion, and inshallah people can also interact and share experiences as well as share questions if they have. Thank you, Sheikhna. Sister Farzana, can you please share your thought process in terms of your experience from your background professionally in terms of what is the grieving process from somebody who's done work in social work and nursing as well as life coaching?
The grieving process is very different for each individual, very different. I think it really depends on the circumstance, the amount of support that they have around, and also how the person is generally. If there's somebody that's quite outspoken, they're able to reach out for support. If they feel confident in speaking to people, then maybe they are able to get through the grieving process a lot quicker because they're able to get the support that they need. Other people are able to manage grief themselves, but grief, as you know, is up and down. So you could feel fine one day and the next day you're shocked at the fact that you're still feeling that sadness and the pain that comes with grief. So it's very unpredictable as well. I don't think there is a clear-cut answer. Like I said, each individual is very different. But from the work that I do within Inspirational Minds, we do try and give some kind of support mechanism to people that do reach out. In social work, a lot of the time, the grief process may cause a lot of other issues, financial difficulties. If it is, for example, the main breadwinner that has passed away, there's financial difficulties that come with that, so they may need support in that area. And until those needs and issues are dealt with, it's very hard to actually go through that grieving process and come out the other side. Like you said before, that it might be even health. If it is something to do with health, that, you know, that's part of the grieving process, there might be an issue with facilities within the home to be able to manage their life after they've gone through that particular type of grief. So until mechanisms are put in place for people, it can be very difficult to kind of smoothly, which is never smooth anyway, go through some form of grieving process.
Absolutely. It's interesting how you're saying that, again, it depends on who we are and how we express ourselves. Somebody who is more, let's say, introverted would probably keep that in more and it could come out potentially later, but somebody who's more extroverted would probably feel more comfortable sharing their emotions, right? So along with these ideas, we have some myths and facts we want to explore. So I'm going to throw them out and then we'd love to hear your thoughts on that. So we have a myth here in terms of the pain will go away faster if you ignore it. What are your thoughts on that in terms of trying to ignore your pain or keep it from surfacing will only make it worse in the long run, right? So for real healing, it's necessary to face your grief and actively deal with it. What are your thoughts on that, Sheikhna?
I think that the process begins at the time of death, at dealing with the deceased, especially in encountering that body, you know, seeing the hole in the ground where they'll be put into, coming to terms with what you're doing. I personally, did the ghusl and kafan, of my wife and, well, not of my wife, but of my son, and witnessed it of my wife. And, it brings a profound closure. Doesn't make you feel better, but it just, you look at it, it gives you that moment that, like, wow, okay, this is where we're gonna end up. This is real. This has happened. I need to come to terms with this. Like, I can't deny what I'm looking at right in front of me. I can't run away from it. But again, everyone is different. Everyone has their own. I'm not judging anyone. I'm just saying that this is personally what I find is, and not only for me. I mean, I deal with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of deaths. I guess that's the nature of my role in the Shia community. I deal with children. I deal with widows. I deal with all kinds of people. I mean, and the whole burial process, dealing with that. If you're able to, is, for some people, can actually be cathartic, and it can be helpful in beginning the process of dealing with the loss that's in front of them and coming to terms with it, that the person is gone now. They've left this world. Like, you know, I took dirt and put it into their grave with my own hands, you know, or before, as they were washed, I came and I saw their body, you know, they're gone. You know, I find that is a practical, can be a practical way. And there's a wisdom as to why Islam, why we have all these practices as well. Right? And why we have Salatul Janazah and Kafan and Dafan and all these things, the theme, and all of these things are for us, not for the dead person. Well, I mean, yeah, they're to help the dead person on their new journey, the deceased, but they're for us. They're reminders for us to come to look at it in front of us. And it's at that point that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts sukoon into the hearts and tranquility. As the tears flow from the eyes when they're looking at their, you know, at their loved one who's now gone, whether it be a child or a wife or a spouse or a husband or father or mother, whatever it may be, it's a very profound spiritual moment. It's a high, really, spiritual state that you enter into. And when you say inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un, at that moment in time, you know, there is no doubt the angel, you know, there's no doubt Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sends sukoon to your heart through the angel.
And as you said, Sheikhna, it's a reminder for us of the reality of this world as well, right? When you witness that process and you observe from the washing of the janazah and then the prayers and the burial, it's a shock to the system to see, you know what, this is our haqq as well that we're all going to experience. And sometimes we get so caught up in worldly pleasures and the plans and all these things that we are supposed to do in our life that we forget also the akhirah. And so when we do go through this process of experiencing such a loss of death, it's a wake-up call in a way. And we've seen so much of that, especially during the pandemic, where a lot of us, for example, the sister has openly spoken about losing her beloved father, and hearing your story, sister, I think has empowered and helped so many people normalize what they've experienced, right? And if we look at the next myth here that we take a look at, it's important to be strong in the face of loss, right? And so that's the myth. And then the fact is, well, feeling sad, frightened, or lonely, again, like we said, is a normal reaction to that loss. Crying doesn't mean that you are weak. You don't need to project your family or friends by putting on a brave front, so to speak, right? Showing your true feelings can help them with you. What are your thoughts on that, sister?
Can I, as well as answering that question, can I just pick up from what Shaykh Vinay said, because I think it's very true, exactly what he has said, that, you know, seeing, being able to give ghusl, seeing your loved one go, being buried, all of that helps. However, I just wanted to make it really relevant for the times that we're having at the moment, obviously, during the COVID crisis. The fact that obviously with some of us, particularly during the time when my father passed away, we were unable to give ghusl. So I know from my brother that's something he's always thought he'd done, and it has an impact on somebody, not being able to follow through with all the rites, not being able to go into hospital and be able to, you know, do all the recitations. Alhamdulillah, we were very lucky, very fortunate. I feel that the nurses that were there at the time were like angels that were brought down for us to be able to carry out, subhanAllah, the final rituals for my father, alhamdulillah, where we were able to do it through Skype right up until his last breath, alhamdulillah. But yes, not being able to do the rites that we have been, you know, we've always done can really bring an impact. And also the fact that trying to ignore your emotions. I'd said once before, I think in another talk, that it's like a child that's pulling on you. So if you ignore something, any kind of pain in life, it will come back. It will come back at a time that you least expect. When you tell your child no, they may go away for 2 minutes, but they will be back and even stronger. So we do need to actually manage the pain as it comes and not ignore. Sorry, I apologize. I've forgotten the question that you had asked me.
No, I think you're answering it beautifully also in terms of being strong, the importance of showing strength when you are experiencing these emotions, right? That you're supposed to put on a face in front of everybody. And so that the myth is it's important to be strong. The reality is no, you're allowed to show your emotions.
Yeah.
You're allowed to show your grief, your tears, that because the sharing also and showing true feelings can help them as well as you, right? And explaining it to children and explaining it to others as well. Yeah.
It helps you bond as a family as well. Grieving together helps you bond, and it helps you to move forward together. Sometimes in grief, some family members may be left behind to some extent. And, you know, if we can grieve together, it shows that it's fine, especially with the children. A lot of the time we tend to hide the fact that, you know, we're grieving. But I think what we need to do is be open as a family, show the children that it's good to grieve, it's good to cry. And there's a lot that we can learn from that. Definitely so.
That's vital to show that. Sorry, I think I'm muted now.
We can hear you.
I'm not sure if I'm muted or not. Yes, there
You're
we go.
okay.
It's vital to show that to our children. I liked how you used the analogy before where if you ignore it and you push it, it's going to come back like that child that's constantly nagging, right? And we use that also in therapy. When there is an issue that you are dealing with, if you don't tackle it face on, if you don't discuss it, validate it, acknowledge it, then it can come back and hit you in the forms of perhaps severe depression or severe anxiety. So it is very helpful to be able to deal with that. Sometimes I've heard from clients where it's really hard for them to deal with the grief. And I believe you mentioned that earlier, when there's so many things that you need to deal with, the burial, perhaps there are money matters, estate matters, and it's hard to get into that grieving if you are caught up dealing with all of this, and then it hits you later, right? So when we take a look at the myth of grieving should last about a year, what would be the fact with that when we explore it, that there's no specific time frame for grieving, right? How long it takes differs from person to person, experience, and also the person that you lost, right? It could be somebody from the family that you don't really have close ties with that wouldn't necessarily impact you the same way as a close family member, right? What are your thoughts on this, Sheikhna, in terms of time frame for grieving?
So we grieve our entire life. There's nothing wrong with that. We see that again in the life of the Ahlul Bayt. There is no shame in continuing on in our life, living a productive, healthy, fulfilling life, and continuing to have a certain amount of grief in our heart. We see that in the life of the Prophet. We see that in the life of A'immah. And they were all men who showed their emotions and their feelings in this way. And there was never any shame or any, but again, what I'm saying here, it's not about putting yourself into a hole and, going into a dark place and not wanting to communicate with people and shutting yourself off from the world and, maybe having certain dark thoughts. No, it's about you're grieving, you're remembering that person. There's moments where it comes back to you, moments of sadness, moments of remembrance, and it's normal to share that for the rest of your breathing life in this world. There's no expiration date for this. Now, what there is an expiration date on is in reminding people about it. Right? There's kiraha in that. Right? I believe after 1 year, I have to double check the mas'ala, maybe at the end of the show, but there's a specific time period that you can remind someone. Otherwise, it's makruh. Because you're not, don't be, there's no need to be an eager beaver here and just try to open up someone's wounds again. Okay, it's passed, so many days have passed now, 40 days or so, or 6 months. No need to keep saying we give your condolences. You said it once, they know it. There's no need to keep, that's the Islamic perspective. That's the ahadith, those are the fiqh rulings actually. There's kiraha in these things. you know, and there's a wisdom to that. You have to let the person take their journey. Don't keep bringing them back again and again, right? And sometimes
the trauma. It's almost like rehashing the trauma.
And sometimes as a community, we don't know where to stop. You know, we just keep reminding people of this horrific loss that they've gone through as if they don't remember. You know, it's not with any bad intentions at all. But if we actually look at the fatawa, you know, there's a limit on that. I have to check the exact time period. I don't remember the exact number of days or whatever, but there's a limit on it, right? And after which it becomes makruh. Obviously, if that person is grieving, we console them and everything, but we don't initiate the conversation again with them, saying, "Oh, really sorry for your loss." You meet them like a year later, right? You know, and there's all spiritual, psychological gems, what I call gems of spiritual psychology within the Sunnah of the Prophet and A'imma Tahirin, you know, in this regard. So, you know, but personal grief can go on for however long it goes on for in different ways, but it has to be something that's healthy, as we read in the traditions. It can't be something that takes control of our life, takes control of our attitude, prevents us from moving on in life, from exploring, you know, because we see again in the life of the Imams, the life of the companions of the Imams, the life of the ladies around them, that they all went on, despite whatever the things they experienced in their life. Eventually they went on to live, alhamdulillah, very fulfilling lives, you know, without forgetting their past.
And it's also the intensity of it, as in anything when it first happens, of course, it's going to be very sharp. There's a sharp pain involved with that loss. But then you notice over time, like you said, you live with it, but then subhanAllah, the pain of it also dulls. It's not as sharp anymore. This is where the acceptance comes in. This is where the bargaining with your environment and with negotiating, so to speak, within your environment, how to cope and deal with it, whether it is through the grieving process with friends, whether it's through the majalis, which I find are incredibly healing when we remember the masab of Ahl al-Bayt and through our pain, of course, but also the rituals that we have and the traditional cultural, some of them are quite beautiful in helping us through the grieving process. And I find within our cultures, we see that more, I find, than the Western cultures. I find is very much more composed and very formal. I find within our culture, and I'm speaking specifically as an Iraqi here, there's a lot of emotion involved. And I find during the day, and I've witnessed it myself, having experienced the death of loved ones in our family in Iraq. And years ago, I happened to be there at the time when this happened. So it was quite a musibah for the family, so to speak. And I recall living in the West, going to Iraq and being there, seeing that was quite different than the grief we experience here. At least I found at that time, where it was very much almost like a dramatic expression of grief, and that families were expected to show that grief. That if you didn't show that type of grief, it means that you didn't love this person. So it's almost like a dramatic show of showing that loss, and it had to be a certain way. And then when people came to show their grief, of course, I had just finished studying psychology, so my brain was fresh observing people's behavior. And I noticed that when people came to show their grief as well, they also almost had to put on a show. Now, as dramatic as that may have been, there's a beauty in that sharing of that pain together and sharing of that grief together and consoling and saying, we feel your pain and we love you and we are here for you. And then the traditions of cooking and passing food out in the name thawab of the deceased, and the du'as and the Quran and the majalis in their honor. And this can go on either 3 days, or they have the 7th day and then the 40th and then the year and so on. And so it was interesting, you know, with this myth that we hear here, if you don't cry, it means you aren't sorry about the loss. And this, when I thought about that, it reminded me of almost the dramatics behind that expression of grief, whether it's to the wife or to the mother of my uncle, God rest his soul. And that stayed in my mind, you know. But here in North America, I found that the grief is quite different. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of if you don't cry means that you're not sorry? But then we also have to come and say, no, the fact is that crying is normal. It's a normal response to that loss and sadness, but it's not the only grief, right? It's not the only way of showing it. Those who don't cry may feel the pain just as deeply, but they just have different ways of showing it. What are your thoughts on that, sister?
I don't think it's just the fact that we all have different ways of showing it. Initially, when the tragedy, as it were, happens, the tragedy in our lives happen, it's a shock. So initially, you just get up and do what you need to do. I remember when my father was in his last moments, what was going through our minds was a preparation that we want the best for him. We want him to be buried as quickly as possible, as possibly the next day. And we know, obviously, during the pandemic time, it's very difficult. The situation is very different from how we've normally seen people passing and the grief process. So in a sense, we were actively thinking. We were still, we had accepted that this is what's happening, and he has passed away, or he is passing away, but we were still very active in moving forward. So I think the shock of it meant that initially we cried and then we stopped, and then we cried and then we stopped. There wasn't very much of a flow. We just got on with what we had to do until the time, alhamdulillah, when we did manage to bury my father. I think that's when it started to slowly develop and we started to grieve. Now, when you mentioned about the rituals, unfortunately, again, during the pandemic, nobody was able to come. We weren't able to go to meet anyone. Families, I know my extended family that live very close, felt very isolated in their grief as well. And I think to some extent that may have prolonged the grief. I don't think we're all fully through the grieving process because we haven't been able to share together. And now slowly, we're meeting people at a distance of the doorstep. This is all increasing the time that we're grieving, in a sense. It's bringing it all back. It's bringing it all very fresh. We're hearing things on the news. We're hearing other people's stories that may be very similar. All of that, it's, I would say, in a sense, the process of grief is like a wound. It can be very deep, it can be shallow, again, like you said, depending on the type of relationship you've had with that person, because loss and grief is an expression of the love that we've had for that person that's passed away. So if we have a very deep wound, it will take long to heal. But even during the healing process, like Shaykh was saying, we might dig at that, or other people may come to us and speak to us. And so again, we'll be digging at the wound and making it fresh again. And so we can end up prolonging that grieving process for a very long time, or we can let it heal within the most prime situation, which we know not everyone, or not many of us, are fortunate to be in a prime situation where we can let the wounds heal that quickly and be able to move on. I hope that gives some imagery or explanation as to how I feel the grieving process has been for us.
No, bless you. That's very thorough, right? And then it comes to the idea of also, how do you move on with your life? I mean, does it mean that you forget about your loss? So moving on means that you've accepted your loss, perhaps, but it's not the same as forgetting, of course. You can move on with your life and keep the memory of somebody or something that you've lost as an important part of you. In fact, as we move through life, these memories can become more and more integral to defining the people that we are, in terms of the connection that we had with this person, their impact on our lives, how we honor them, how we remember them, right? And I see that a lot with people. I personally have experienced that in terms of, what does moving on mean? Does it mean that you forget about your loss? And I recall years ago, a client who was dealing with grief brought this beautiful quote. And if I remember it correctly, it said something along the lines of, experiencing death or that loss doesn't mean that you cannot smile or you cannot experience joy again. Obviously, it won't be the same way. As you both try to take a dig at this answer, I'm going to try and remember it because I found it so profound. So what are your thoughts, Sheikhna, with that in terms of moving on with your life and forgetting or not forgetting about your loss?
Well, again, you know, when we look at the examples of the Prophet and his family, the Ahlul Bayt, we see that that they all, you know, went on to do other things eventually with their lives. That they did not allow these tragedies, they did not become prisoners of their sadness.
Right.
They realized that things come and things go from this world, and I'm not saying that in a nonchalant way. I'm not saying that in any flippant way. It is a reality. There's ebb and flow in life, and as we are more centered spiritually with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, through our salah, through our Quran, through our understanding of the purpose of life, purpose of our existence in this world, we then are able to understand how to deal with separation. Separation is very hard, but this is where we need that connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and often it can be of two ways. And again, this is all assists in moving on. This assists in allowing this person to live a functional and healthy life as they move forward in their life, which is the understanding that everything has a purpose. God wants me to be happy. God does not want me to be sad. God does not want me to become a prisoner of my emotions, to become a prisoner of my sadness, to be trapped in this place. That is not what Allah wants from us. Allah wants sa'adah from us. He wants us to be happy. He wants us to be joyful. He wants us to smile. Because that's a demeanor of a moment. Except when they're, of course, in front of Allah, they're not smiling, They're in a state of contemplation and tawbah. But when they're with the mu'mineen, they're smiling. That's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us. It doesn't mean we'll get there on day 1 or day 2 or week 3 or week 20. But God doesn't want us to be sad always. He wants us to understand the bigger picture. And that can only truly come about when we understand our aqidah and we are centered within ourselves. And one of the things that I see very often is that individuals who have problems with their aqidah before the death often have a lot of problems after the death.
Yes.
They've already had problems with their aqidah, so they can't deal with this. They don't understand, why me? Why did God choose to do this to me? They start asking these existential questions, not in a way of wanting a philosophical answer, but in a way of a kind of accusation against God himself. And those individuals deal with loss in a different way, often in a very unhealthy way from a spiritual perspective. I won't comment on a psychological perspective, is not my specialization, but from a spiritual perspective, it's very unhealthy. Because now we start saying, and those people have the hardest time to move on. The hardest time to, I don't like using the word move on, the hardest time to try to put the pieces of their life back together slowly, step by step by step by step. It's not something that happens overnight, but because when we love people as we are supposed to love Allah, and when we lose them, we realize that we've been worshiping them. يحبونهم كحب الله والذين آمنوا أشد حبا لله. Right? That the problem is that they loved all these people like they were supposed to love Allah Azza wa Jal. وَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا أَشَدُّ حُبًّا لِلَّهِ. But the believers are most intense in the love for Allah. And again, I'm not saying this flippantly. If we truly are centered spiritually and we understand the message of the Quran and we endeavor in our life to be spiritual, to be in a state of spiritual purity, then these verses of the Quran are not just slogans. They're realities. And then they allow us to understand that, look, this happened to me, but ultimately God wants me to be happy in this world. God wants me to live a productive life. So from a spiritual perspective, it all depends on what vantage point we're seeing the situation.
And I found the quote, scrambling to look for it because it was just too good. I had it on my wall in my office after the student explained it to me, and I asked them, can you please write that down? I think others can really benefit from this. And whenever I have profound quotes with the therapy session with clients, I'll get them to write it out on their hand and we'll put it up. And this was one that was in my office for years, where it says, that life does not cease to be funny when people die any more than it ceases to be serious when people laugh, by George Bernard Shaw. And it's such a profound statement, I think, to what we've been talking about in terms of how we move on, how it impacts us, and how we choose to look at it. And absolutely agree with you, Shaykh. And I see that with clients who do have deep faith, whether it's Islam or another faith, some kind of faith that they hold on to, and spirituality, they tend to move on in a lighter way, not as intense or grief stricken, so to speak, when they accept that inna lillah wa inna ilayhi raji'un. It's such a powerful way of dealing with it. And like you said, until it happens to you, you really don't connect with that idea until you actually experience it, or you have somebody very close to you who experienced it and you see what they go through. But subhanAllah, all of these beautiful ahadiths, all these spiritual quotes from whether our religion or different faiths, they're all meant to help with that, right? And sister, what are your thoughts on that in terms of what we were talking about, in terms of moving on and forgetting, and how this stays with you?
So I've been through the grief process before. I had a miscarriage after one child. And I also, my grandmother passed away. She lived with us, we were very close. And I held her hand and she passed away. So I've been through it before. And I know when I had the miscarriage, I only had one child. So it wasn't, if I wanted to sit in a state of grief for a bit longer, as it were, consciously, I was able to do that because life was managed. My husband was able to manage with the other child. I have, in this particular situation with my father passing away, obviously, I was very close to my father, and it is difficult to move on. But for the sake of 3 children that I have, for the sake of a mother who's lost her husband, and other family members as well, I felt that I had to, in a sense, put a system in place for me to be able to move on. So initially, I didn't feel sad in the sense of, an overwhelmingness to cry continuously, because I know I was in shock. After some time, I started to cry all the time and I couldn't stop. And particularly in the evenings when I returned home from my family. At the moment, during the pandemic, we're all quite lonely in that sense. So there's no family members to share your grief with, and you share your grief throughout the day. Because I know when my grandmother passed away, there were people at home constantly. By the time you get home, you're really tired. You'll recite namaz, dua, and you'll go to sleep. Here, the day was kind of lonely. The evenings were lonely. So I ended up falling into a situation where I would wait till the children were upstairs, and then I would spend some time for myself, maybe on the musalla or just reciting dua, whatever worked for me at the time. And ended up finding it became a ritual in a sense, because I would do it at a particular time every day. And I noticed that. And I thought, well, actually, if I do this, I'm not going to be able to move on. So I set myself targets. I said to myself that I will go back to work, after another 2 to 3 weeks. And I'd already set that in place. I mean, it works for me. It doesn't work for everyone. I set myself a target that up until the end of Ramadan, I will stay up through the night until Fajr and recite the things that actually reminded me of my father, like Ziyad Ashura. There were munajats, as many things. And I used to obviously spend that time thinking about him, but at the same time, like listening to Ziyad Ashura, I would remember Imam Hussain, and that would give me some level of comfort and energy as well at the same time. So I found myself falling into this ritual, and then I set my limit that by the time it gets to the end of Ramadan, I will then go and reduce to maybe by about midnight. I would then, complete my duas and whatever that made me feel good, because it got to a point where I actually felt guilty sometimes. If I didn't do it, or if I didn't spend enough time, I would then feel a sense of guilt, which is, again, something that holds us back. And why are we feeling guilty? Why should we feel guilty? We weren't in control of this situation. This was a choice of Allah. We tend to forget that our family members are not ours. we own nothing. You know, they're people that have been brought down to support us, to guide us, to take us through our journey. And then I set a target that by the time it gets to Arba'een, that then I would start looking at maybe reducing some of my time spent remembering Dad to maybe a Thursday night and maybe a Tuesday night as well. And at the same time, you know, do Dua Tawassul on a Tuesday night, do Dua Kumail and what we normally do, but it would be at a different level for me because of the grief that I'm still trying to deal with. And I think setting those targets has helped me to slowly move on and make it okay to be able to grieve, if that makes sense.
It does, and it's so beautiful how you put it in a routine, so to speak, with those targets. And I think that can really help people who are all over the place struggling. And I think there's also a difference, and I've seen this with whether it's within my work or within the community and myself, if it's a sudden death versus a death where you almost had a bit of time to prepare for it. And it sounds like what you were describing is that you almost had time in a way because you knew potentially this is what's going to happen, versus a death that suddenly took place, whether La Samahallah, and we see this also even in our own community, like suicide, for example, or a sudden car accident. And that's what we experienced in my family in Iraq with my cousin years before that, but also my uncle, Allah yarhamhum. So when it's a sudden versus almost a preparation, I see that with clients where somebody could be experiencing the loss of a father who is dying from cancer. And so it's almost like you do the grieving process before they pass away, during that time, and then afterwards. And I see that with clients, how afterwards, subhanallah, they've gone through it, so it's not as intense anymore. So with that in mind, I'd like to ask the question and get both of your views if possible on it. How are, you know, in the process of moving on, why do some people struggle to move on? Why do they cannot move on? And I've seen that with people where they still intensely remember the loss, and they could be potentially religious, spiritual people, but they're still stuck. There's a struggle to move on. What are your thoughts on that, Shaykh, and then Sister Farzana?
I think, you know, again, you know, I don't want to pass any judgment because I think people have their own timetables, and we all have different ways that we process our emotions and our feelings, and, you know, and what they mean to us, first of all. You know, so I just wanted to preface my, you know, whatever I say with that. So it's not, there isn't really a set time period per se for moving on. But eventually, you know, we have to realize that also, what would they want from us? You know, if they truly loved us, they want us to be happy. And ultimately, more important than them is Allah Azza wa Jal. And Allah wants us to be happy. Allah does not want us to walk around this earth in a state of perpetual sadness, except for Ahlul Bayt. They are the exception. Our family is not. Our tragedy is not A'adhamul Musibah. And we are not, you know, the center of the universe. The Ahlul Bayt are the center of the universe, and their tragedy and their loss and their suffering and the, you know, that's why Majalis al-Aza and things like that are so therapeutic for the Mu'mineen. Ziyarat Ashura, as the sister mentioned already, is so therapeutic. It's not, I don't even like the word saying therapeutic. It's so efficacious. It's spiritually efficacious, you know, because it reminds us that, wait a second, you know, whatever I've gone through, it pales in comparison to what my Imam went through, and to what Sayyidah Zainab went through, and Sayyidah Sakina, and you know, and all these individuals for whom I live and I die, and for whom I breathe. So, and then even then they moved on. I mean, many of them went on to live very productive life. Look at Fatima bint al-Hussain alayhi salam, the daughters of Imam Hussain, you know, the one that survived, the one that was left over. They went on to live productive, very normal lives. despite the fact of everything that they went through, despite the fact of whatever it is that they experienced, because they understood that is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from them. When you understand what Allah wants from you, what brings a rida of Allah Azza wa Jal, then we operate on a different timetable and in a different way. But when we position when we don't perhaps have a proper holistic understanding and holistic yaqeen and conviction of what is the foundation of Islamic spirituality, then sometimes we may not be able to understand what God wants from us in our life. So I think it's very important to be cognizant of that. You know, and then obviously to look at the examples of the Imams, of the companions of the Imams, of our great scholars, you know, of the great ladies and men of Islam, and to take their examples, you know, and to see that, you know, that's what they wanted. That's what Allah wanted from them, and that's what Allah wants from us.
Thank you, Sheikhna, for sharing that. And I think when you put things into perspective that way, internally versus externalizing it, and putting the grief is how you described it, that their musibah is not bigger than mine. When you put things into perspective that way, and especially a person who is able to connect with faith, absolutely this can be part of the healing in terms of helping people move on. Sister, what are your thoughts on this?
I think he's answered that so well. MashaAllah. I would agree with everything you've said. Sometimes though, like I said, with my situation, there was a reason for me to move on. I had to move on. Also, my work as a social worker during this pandemic, there was, you know, a lot of people that were dying on my own caseload at work. And I had to manage the family situation. You know, if it was somebody with a learning disability and the parent had passed away, so for me, there was a need to go back to work. There was a need for me to kind of strengthen myself up for my family, for my mother, for my children. And so I had to move on. A lot of the time, there may not be a reason to move on. There may not be anything to move on to. There may not be a job. There may not be a family member or anything like that. So I think this is where we need society to come in, family members, to support somebody in moving on, to help them find a goal. Whether it is, you know, I want to study tafsir, well, actually, that's a good time to maybe start. Maybe let's look at what's available out there, and let's go on the net and find things that can be done to fill that time. Until and unless that time is filled with other things, and the energy is channeled. Another thing I found, that there's a lot of energy in grieving. Yeah. And to some extent, and this is all by accident, again, although my father didn't pass away from a sudden death, as it were, it was a shock to us because we weren't expecting this. This wasn't something that was expected at all.
And I think this pandemic,
with something, sorry?
And sister, I was just going to say, and the virus and the pandemic, subhanAllah, I don't think any of us expected that we would be potentially losing the people that we have lost because of the virus. And I hear my mother, bless her in her wisdom, who says, well, we've all been written our times. Perhaps this was their time, and we didn't realize that there was this virus that would take their lives, subhanAllah. So as sudden as it is, and shocking as it is, when we bring in our spirituality and psychology to help us accept and work with it, this somewhat helps a bit. And that, subhanAllah, this was their time, even though we're constantly saying why, right?
Why? Definitely. That's something that keeps coming up. Why? But at the end of the day, a lot of the time, even though we accept, we still bring that person back in our life in some ways. And that's where it can become more painful. And this is where I'm saying that's where, in a sense, we're not letting that wound heal because we keep bringing them back because we feel guilty. But I'm not remembering them. I need to bring them back again. I need to remember them. We need to make sure that when we do that, we don't start digging too deep, that we start the whole grieving process again. There's no harm.
So can you explain that guilt, that feeling of guilt? Because I'm sure a lot of people could be experiencing that when they have, let's say, moved on and they're not constantly thinking about their loved ones. How would you explain that and work with that guilt? And then inshallah, we'll finish up with the one last question.
I remember somebody some time ago saying that guilt is something that we bring upon ourselves because we're bringing ourselves into the picture. It's about us. It's not actually about the person. And what we need to understand is the situation, the circumstance is not in our control. So how can we feel guilty that we didn't do something? If the situation was in our control, if there was something that I could have done, then I understand the guilt. But the feeling of guilt is something for us to be able to bring that person back into our life, in a sense. I'm not sure if that's making any sense. Whenever I felt guilty, it's because I didn't maybe remember him enough. I didn't cry enough, or I got busy with something else when, I'm supposed to be grieving. But it shouldn't be like that. I'm not supposed to be doing anything. In fact, like Shaykh had so perfectly said, that this is not what Allah wants from us. And I know for a fact my father would never want that. He's a very get up and go person. He always has been. And he would say, if he could see and speak to me, why are you in this situation? You need to get on with life. You have so much more that you need to achieve, that you need to do, that Allah wants from you. So sitting and grieving over me, in fact, I feel to some extent what we can do is every action that we take, we give that sawab to the person that's passed away. And that may help with the grief. So for example, the talk today, inshallah, the sawab of this will go to the marhums, and things like that. Anything that we do, even if we cook something, we can call it Fatiha even within the home. And the sawab of the efforts that we've put into cooking this meal will go to the person that's passed away. All of this can help us to get through the grief.
And it's such a beautiful way of redirecting that energy of grief. Like you said, it takes so much energy to be in that, and to put it in a positive way, reframing it and redirecting it in a healthy, positive way that you feel good, and you're giving and making sure that there is a thawab, a continuous thawab in the name of the beloved that you've lost. Allah bless you both. I have a direct question from our audience member. It says, could you comment on how children process grief and how to help them make sense of a loss? So kids around the age of 5 to 7. What are your thoughts on that for both of you? Yes.
Well, I'm not a therapist, so I wouldn't comment on a child's psychology and things. That's not my area of expertise. But from a spiritual perspective, it's, we're told in the traditions that children can handle a lot. You'd be surprised, as to what they're very resilient, and not to lie to them and to be honest with them as to what's happened. Don't tell them Baba or Mama or Dada's gone or Grandpa's gone on a journey, to Africa or something, and he's not coming back. No, you tell them the truth, because that's what we see that they did. And you explain to them in whatever way that they can understand, through drawing, through art, through simple children's books, about that there is an afterlife, and that's where we go when we pass from here. I obviously am going through that myself on a daily and weekly basis with my own child, and I found that to be helpful. And just to remind them that, that death is not a punishment, it is not a curse, it is, ultimately, I guess you could say, a blessing from Allah, really, because now they're in a better place, right? Or at least we hope that they are. And, and then we can still stay in touch with them through doing different kinds of activities. From a spiritual perspective, that's visiting their grave, reciting the Fatiha, Sadaqah, things like that. From a spiritual perspective, that's I find is useful.
Bless you. And that's really important. As our children, mashallah, are very perceptive and aware, it is important to speak about the truth to them rather than saying they've gone somewhere. But again, it depends on the development of that child, where they are at, right? So it's important to be aware about that. And again, especially given the pandemic that we are in right now, there has been these losses where we do need to explain to our children what's happening. And mashallah, there's so many different resources out there provided for parents and families on how to speak to your child about loss, how to speak to your child about grief and the virus as well. So it is really important, absolutely, depending on your child's development, where they're at, to be able to explain that to them. And you hear some children talk openly about it. They may not understand the depth of the sadness depending on how old they are, but you will hear them say, they've gone to Jannah, or et cetera, et cetera. And that's a healthy, positive way rather than perhaps scary image of what death could be. So it's really important to normalize it, I would say. Sister Farzana, would you like to give your thoughts around that? And then we'll wrap up actually with just a summary of how we can manage grief and loss, inshallah.
In our situation, we try to let the children be involved as much as possible. So even during the Skype sessions that we had during the last moments with my father, I let the children decide whether they wanted to sit in and watch or whether they didn't. And we tried to give them all a responsibility. Maybe one was reciting tasbih, one was reciting the kursi. So they felt involved, they felt part of the process. And even after my father passed away, we would include them in different activities that we would do, maybe giving fatih or packing fatih or whatever it was. So they were part of it. Unfortunately, they weren't able to go to the cemetery during the burial, but we were able to see online. So the children were able to see, obviously because of the pandemic, the way, because the less numbers go to the cemetery, the burial was relayed on live stream. So the children were able to watch that. And I really think that's key. They need to see what happens, and that gives just as much as it gives us closure, it gives the children closure. After obviously he passed away, and they to get them to realize, I explained to them that, obviously my dad had many talents, some of which were art and Islamic calligraphy. And so I said to my two daughters in particular, because they're the younger ones, that, Nana's not going to be here with us anymore. And now the legacy of in a sense, the Islamic calligraphy went to my older daughter, which is what I told her. And so she pulled out all the calligraphy stuff she had done with Nana, and she kind of made a memorial in her room with all of the calligraphy. And the younger one did the same in her room. She took out all the artwork that she had done with him and she put it all out. So in a sense, it's something that they've never done before, and they realize that I'm going to treasure this. This is mine because I won't see him again. Again, these are all things that give those children some level of closure. Now, the children may not grieve like us, in the sense it may not be as continual. They'll forget, they'll go and play, they'll watch TV, they'll read a book. But what we have to, as parents, be prepared for is at any moment, that child can just come down crying.
Yeah. And
we sit with them and we ask them, why, what happened, what did you see, what did you experience, how are you feeling, and let them cry and cry with them, be with them throughout this journey. And inshallah, that will help the grieving process to be a lot more smoother and a loving process.
Thank you so much, Sister and Sheikhna, for sharing your thoughts, your experiences. May Allah bless you and your loved ones, and in sharing your thoughts around this. I think inshallah it can help many people who are experiencing some kind of loss. I know we focus mostly on the area of losses and death and grief, and like we said earlier, loss could be anything. Could be a loss of a friendship, a relationship, a job, or divorce. And sometimes it could be a negative situation that you've come out of and you still feel a loss, because it is a loss. You may still feel sad from the sad, difficult situation that you are no longer in, but it's a loss regardless. And so, as we were saying, everybody experiences it in a different way. It's an individual experience. And there's so many different ways of getting back on track. Again, faith, as we explored today, has been a huge factor in helping us. And as the Shaykh so eloquently put, there's no masa'a bigger than the Ahlul Bayt, and this can potentially put things into perspective for us, but also validating our experiences that yes, what we are going through is difficult. It's okay to show emotion. You are allowed, and it's okay to normalize that around you, whether you're a male or female. Asking for support to help you get through it, whether it's through counseling, whether using the Nasiha helpline, or talking to a family or friend or a spiritual advisor in the community. It's so important to share that, whether it's the rituals, and I know it's been very difficult during the pandemic to observe the usual traditionals, but subhanAllah, we've done it online, as we've seen with the sister and her blessed father, where they've done the majlis online and the burial online. We've seen that a lot within our community. That's helped people find some kind of closure, acceptance of dealing with this loss. We're also here for you as well, whether Sister Farzana through her work, the Shaykh, and we can refer you and connect you with resources as well if you are looking for that. Again, we wanted to thank the Shaykh as well as Sister Farzana for joining us today. Any final thoughts before we wrap up?
I just wanted to thank you for giving myself the opportunity to actually speak and share a platform with Shaykh, which is, I'm very honored. Thank you.
Bless you, sister. May Allah bless your marhameen and your beloved father. Thank you, Shaykhna. Your final thoughts?
No, just I think this is a a wonderful platform. It's a good discussion, inshallah, and a healthy conversation. Jazakumullah khairan.
Bless you, Shaykhna, and may Allah bless you and your marhameen, inshallah. Thank you to all of our audiences who have joined us. If we haven't answered your questions, we'll try to answer them another time, inshallah. Please, like we said, connect with the resources that are available. It's so important that we have the sense of community, even though during the pandemic we are physically separated from each other and one another. Again, inshallah, we dedicate even this simple gesture to all our marhameen from our guests and in our community, inshallah. Please recite Fatiha for all of your marhameen. And we end our program, inshallah, with salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.